Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief here at Devex. And welcome to our weekly show where we talk about all the biggest headlines in global development, in global health, and humanitarian response, and all the things the Devex community is interested in and cares about. We are now also on YouTube. If you are listening to this podcast and want to see our smiling faces, come and join us on YouTube. I'm joined this week by two colleagues, Sarah Jerving. Hey, Sarah.
Hey Raj, great to join you.
Yeah, good to be with you. Sarah is, of course, a senior health reporter here at Devex based in Nairobi. And also my colleague, Colin Lynch, is here. Hey, Colin.
Hey, Raj, how are you? Thanks for having me.
And Colin is our senior global reporter. He's based in New York. He covers all things UN. And so I'm really especially happy to have you this week, Colin, because really everyone is talking about nothing other than the UN General Assembly, which is coming up in just a few days. And we are certainly at Devex sending a big team. It's something that as I go to meetings and have conversations here in Washington, D.C., everybody's asking about. So we get to ask you, and you've been covering UN General Assemblies for many years. You know this well. You have a big piece in Devex this week that's kind of a look ahead. What are you expecting from this year's UN General Assembly?
So, a lot of drama coming into the event. There are basically, this is not just one summit, it's two summits. So there's the Future Summit, which is to try to sort of map out a path for the future of international cooperation. Then there's the annual, which is the largest gathering of world leaders, the UN General Assembly general debate. So both of those are sort of squished together. The Future Summit is really kind of, I think looked at as a sort of legacy defining effort to reform the UN to make it more fit for purpose in the modern age. There are issues like expanding the Security Council so it doesn't reflect the balance of power in the Second World War. There are issues about reforming the international financial architecture so that countries that suffered terribly without a safety net after the COVID pandemic, dealing with the struggles of climate, are that they have more of a stake in the way that the multilateral development banks sort of address some of their needs and concerns. And so a lot of big issues. It's a couple of days. The declaration, Future Summit declaration is supposed to be on Sunday. The membership still haven't agreed on the final document. Russia, Syria, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Pakistan, a number of other countries have had sort of last minute objections. This often plays out in big high level negotiations where they bring it down to the wire. There is an expectation that they will pass this thing. But, one sort of issue that's kind of, on everybody's mind is that, is this the right moment to be doing something so ambitious? If you see, what's going on at the UN these days, the Security Council is deeply divided. There's huge geopolitical gulf between the global north and the south, between the US, Russia, and China, paralyzed on the Security Council. No one can really do much to stop wars in, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan. So there's this sort of feeling that we're trying to look to the future, but we can't even sort out today. So, I think that's kind of this sort of underlying theme sort of playing out throughout the whole high level week.
You use the word legacy, and I guess part of the rationale here is this is a legacy move for the Secretary General, right? He's in his final year in office, and I think he's looking to say, how do I revitalize the UN at a moment, as you say, when there's plenty of skeptics about the future of this agency? It was interesting to read your piece, how existential some of the comments are from people who, like us, have been attending the General Assembly for many years and who are close UN observers. People are really questioning the fundamental relevance of the UN. And it seems like this is at least an effort for Guterres in his last time in office here to say, I'm going to put a stamp on this to show there is relevance. We can get through some of the traditional perennial complaints that this institution is not representative, that it's constantly there, it's just constantly stuck because it was set up so long ago when the world looks so different than it does now. And he wants to get ahead of things like AI, right? Kind of the digital issues that are part of this. So it does seem like this is a legacy defining moment for him and for the UN. It's all wrapped up together a bit.
Right. It's interesting. We've said if you listen to speeches, if you really pay close attention to speeches from the Secretary General over the last couple of years, they are so dark and gloomy. The world is falling apart. It's unraveling. It's coming apart at the center. Really, really dark, gloomy sort of projections of where the world is headed. I think, but also it's interesting. I mean, already you can see that the Secretary General has been refocusing the UN and in ways that are quite controversial. For instance, as you mentioned, he has tried to look at sort of issues that are, common goods agenda like climate change, international cooperation, sustainable development goals, AI. How is the UN going to sort of like manage this transformation? One of the things he sort of moved away from, and it was interesting because when he first came into office, he really wanted to focus on conflict prevention. He's kind of out, the UN is kind of out of that game now. I mean, this is the organization that was involved in, resolving conflicts from Namibia to El Salvador to the Balkans. A lot of failures, some successes, but the UN is just not present. I mean, the Secretary General.
That's not for lack of trying though, right? Because I know when Guterres got the job, he came from UNHCR and there was a sense this is where he really wants, this is where his heart is. It's avoiding and addressing conflict in the world. Didn't he really lean into that agenda? Has it just not
Yeah,
worked?
right. But he's leaned to it in a way where he's taken the humanitarian piece and he's tried to sort of focus the UN's work on this is the area where we can make progress. So if you look at, how he dealt with the war in Ukraine, it was negotiating the Ukraine grain deal, right? It was a great success. It's kind of fallen apart since then because of Russia, but that kind of reflects his tendency. So if you see what's happening in Gaza, I mean, perfectly good reasons, but he hasn't spoken to Netanyahu since October 7th. And he has really, you don't see him in the region. I mean, I think he took he went to the region to sort of highlight the humanitarian response, but he's not been engaged in sort of negotiations. I mean, he's had recent trips to, areas where, climate change is the threat, but not in sort of peace and security. And you find that there are these independent organizations outside the UN that are quite active on the mediation front because the UN isn't doing it in the way it used to.
What do you attribute that to? And then I want to get Sarah in the discussion on some of the health aspects of this year's General Assembly. But is this lack of trying? Is this the UN has lost so much relevance that he doesn't have a platform to be the lead mediator in these global conflicts?
So I think from his perspective, I think the main reason is the sort of geopolitical moment that we find ourselves in. A feeling that, if the big powers are divided politically, that there's very little scope ability for the UN to achieve things politically, diplomatically, if you don't have the permanent members of the Security Council on board. So I think that's probably the most important reason. But I think also in his experience with as High Commissioner for Refugees, I think he always had sort of, a kind of tendency towards, a kind of negative view about these big multinational or complex peacekeeping operations in Congo and Mali, that they were huge commitments. They weren't particularly successful. And he's been, he's been very negative about peacekeeping. I mean, the Americans are trying to transfer a Kenyan-led police force in Haiti into a UN peacekeeping operation. And the Secretary General has, publicly come out against the Americans on that. So he's not a big supporter of UN peacekeeping. And so that, takes the UN out of a game that's been sort of central to its identity for decades.
One of the themes at these UN General Assemblies, especially in the last decade or so, I think has been global health. Like columns pointing to some of the ways that the UN is maybe, and especially this meeting, feels less relevant in the global stage in an era when the big powers are divided and they're doing their own thing. But actually, global health is maybe the exception where, at least I've found, there have been so many high-level meetings on pandemic preparedness, on universal health coverage. The General Assembly has become a really key moment, like the World Health Assembly in Geneva, to elevate those issues, even if it's not about a policy declaration necessarily. It's a place where the global health community has started to really convene and try to amplify messages. What are you hearing, Sarah? I saw your piece on AMR. Like, what are you expecting from a health perspective coming out of the GA this year?
It's a really interesting point that you made, because I had the same sentiment when I was reading through Column's coverage, is that the multilateralism has actually become more effective in the global health space in the wake of the pandemic, and a lot of that was kind of countries realizing everything that fell apart during the pandemic. How can we create systems that are more equitable? And a lot of it has been like to the credit of like continents like the African continent, where they have really kind of worked to galvanize around making systems more effective and working with the international system around that. But the big issue for UNGA this year in the health space is antimicrobial resistance, and that's known as AMR. And so there's going to be a high-level meeting next week, Thursday, where it's expected that there'll be a political declaration with some concrete goals agreed upon. And to back up for those who are not following the AMR discussion, it's when antimicrobials or such as antibiotics become no longer effective. And that's a huge issue that can compromise efforts like treating infectious diseases. So a key reason why the global community is coming together on this issue is it's an issue that's been kind of historically sidelined because it has, it's more of a slow moving threat compared to some other health issues like COVID-19 was. But it does impact a lot of different sectors. So there is really a need for a coordinated global approach. One Health approach is what they call it. And there's pretty grim outlooks for AMR. It's estimated that AMR could kill more than 39 million people between now and 2050. That's new figures that just came out this week. So there is the global community, global health community, has been working on a draft in recent months of this political declaration. And that has some goals like reducing global deaths associated with bacterial antimicrobial resistance by 10% by 2030. And there's been some tensions and criticisms of wording within this draft. So for example, there is a portion about expanding access to human antibiotic use to at least 70% globally. I've been told that kind of framing it in this way is a bit counterintuitive because calling for an increase in access could also result in increase in inappropriate consumption.
But if you have more access, you might get access to the right antibiotics, right? I mean, isn't that part of the issue is that people are prescribed the wrong ones because they don't have access to the right ones?
Yeah, and that's a big issue in, for instance, the African Union just put out a report on their priorities on AMR, and one of the issues is that some countries don't have access to the kind of most effective antibiotic to be used for a certain treatment, and or there's issues with diagnostics. So some hospitals, health facilities don't have enough diagnostics on hand, so they just kind of prescribe whatever. And there's also pharmacies that you can go in and get pharmacies or kind of like, black market situations where you can just get antibiotics that aren't prescribed to you. So it's so that's a big issue. There is kind of this issue of overuse, but also kind of ensuring that people have access to the correct antibiotics.
Yeah, and the other one related, which is why they talk about One Health, is antibiotics for animals.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's in some ways the biggest part of the problem. And there's, when you think about this being a really multilateral issue that you need the UN on, it's partly because of that. It's that you need the agricultural industry to care about this too. It's not just the health community that has to be aligned. And you think about all the regulatory regimes that are associated, all the industries that are associated to try to actually solve this. It's quite a messy problem that you're probably not going to do as any individual country or even region.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the interesting things as well is it manifests itself differently in different regions. And that's why the African Union wanted to put out kind of their priorities, because in high income countries, we do have the issue of overusing antibiotics that's fueling AMR. But on kind of in lower and middle income countries, there's also the issue of just lack of infection prevention. So you have kind of issues of like access to clean water and sanitary conditions. That's creating a situation where infections can spread, and then either you'll see kind of mutations, or there's just not or like inaccurately treating these infections. And then the other aspect is access to vaccines. So if you have like broader access to vaccines, then you have less infections that are kind of fueling that AMR problem.
Yeah, the parallel I see in this a little bit is the climate issue where, there's been a big debate, columns written a lot about the kind of global north versus global south divide, and how much trust has been really lost, I think, in that relationship in general. And climate has been one of those issues where a lot of the global south is saying, the rhetoric and the narrative and the funding is going to things that don't understand our lived reality, which is we have energy poverty. We're not causing carbon emissions. We don't have anywhere near enough energy. And they feel a bit left out of where funding and debate is moving. And I kind of got the same impression looking at your piece on AMR and the African Union's take on it, which is, you can have this very global north conversation about creating the next, more advanced antibiotics that you can use after the frontline antibiotics don't work. But what about us? We're not even getting basic antibiotics, and amoxicillin isn't available, and for kids who need it, and we don't have the water and sanitation systems, so we're having disease spread that way. It does feel like there's an attempt here to shift the debate a little bit and remind the global audience at the UN General Assembly that this is actually a broader problem with different dimensions, not just the ones you might be seeing in the global north.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a super complicated problem, and countries actually develop their own national plans for combating AMR. And so the African Union said that there's an estimated 2 billion to 6 billion needed annually to address this issue in Africa, but the annual budget for AMR national action plans is around 100 million. So it is like, as you say, they're like countries are defining their priorities in this area, and they just want to kind of come to UNGA with a unified voice of, this is what the continent is asking for, and like we do need funding around this as well.
I had a question for Sarah. I was really taken in your piece by is one line about deaths from antimicrobial resistance surpassing those of malaria, HIV, and tuberculosis in Africa, which is quite extraordinary. I didn't know that. And I'm just sort of curious, to what degree, like say in the United States or in some of the donor countries, are they looking at that and going, I mean, holy, what are we going to do? Are they really energized by it? The numbers would indicate no, but I'd be curious to see like how they're dealing with this. I mean, this is obviously a huge cross-border issue, even more so than perhaps some other infectious disease issues, and I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So AMR has a public relations problem in that there's not a lot of kind of urgency around it, because it has been a slow moving phenomenon, but it does tie into a lot of some of the diseases that donors are prioritizing, like malaria, like tuberculosis. So kind of within that targeting, there is kind of that prioritization.
Yeah, I guess like with all of these issues, understanding that data is important, because so much of what happens at the General Assembly is trying to catch the zeitgeist, and get everyone talking about your issue. So there's a natural desire to make the numbers sound bigger or worse, or to connect other issues to, nowadays, for example, everybody in the health space I talk to is like, well, climate has all the energy. How do we connect climate and health better? And there are legitimate ways to do that, and then there's ways that might be a stretch. And I guess we'll probably have to take a similar lens when we think about some of the AMR questions and what are the real solutions. How many of them are solutions in that AU report, for example, that we would have been calling for anyway under the heading of universal health coverage? Things like better water and sanitation systems, better access to primary health care. I mean, these are things you can call them AMR if AMR is the issue of the moment, if there's a high level meeting, if there's a tension, but it's not just an AMR topic, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Just kind of these fundamentals around building up stronger health systems will combat AMR. So if you are giving, if communities have access to vaccines, if they have access to diagnostics, clean and hygienic health facilities, then those are like really, so yeah, and the regulation, like one of the interesting things as well is just building up kind of local manufacturing of antibiotics in low and middle income countries will make a huge difference as well, and that is kind of a priority as well.
Yeah, and that cuts across so many other topics. You had a story, speaking of vaccines, about a really remarkable polio vaccination campaign that just happened in Gaza. And it's really, an incredible story of, against all odds, health workers putting together a plan at the micro level, targeting hundreds of thousands of kids after there was one child who has sadly been infected with polio, and we saw this reemergence of the disease. Tell us a little bit more about that piece. It's really an amazing piece and worth reading.
Yeah, so the first round of a polio vaccination campaign just finished up in Gaza. And that was, as you mentioned, the first polio case was found in August after Gaza had been polio free for 25 years. So I had conversations with WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA to get a better sense of what it was like to deliver these vaccines in such a difficult operating environment. So a humanitarian pause was agreed to, but it was partial. So each day of the hostilities, each day the hostilities paused at 6 a.m., but then resumed at 2 p.m. And Israeli authorities had divided Gaza into 3 zones, and health workers had 3 to 4 days to vaccinate children in each zone while the hostilities continued in the other zones. And then when they were done, they moved to the next zone. And so this lasted for 12 days. And given the widespread displacement and destruction over the past 11 months, the biggest challenge was ensuring that enough children were reached by this campaign. And this has been conflict where families have been constantly on the move. The Israeli authorities have had displacement orders and whatnot, and just huge destruction of homes and infrastructure. But vaccinating at least 90% is the threshold for ensuring that it was successful. So the vaccination campaign ended on the 12th, the first phase, the first dose. And there are 65 independent monitors who have done surveys to examine the proportion of children that were vaccinated to kind of cross-check it. And a key way that they're doing this is looking at the purple dye on the fingers of children, which they received after vaccination. So they're looking to see if a significant number of children are missed, and children will need the second dose, and that's expected to take place in about 4 weeks. But the conditions around that campaign are still under discussion. And there's hopes that kind of there will be another humanitarian pause and that will be respected. And then there will also be efforts to ensure that surveillance systems that were disrupted by the war, and that includes testing sewage and then also testing children with signs of paralysis. So there's efforts to restore those to determine whether they were actually able to halt the transmission of polio in Gaza. And one of the issues with this campaign was that the presence of polio was detected very late. According to genomic sequencing, it could have entered Gaza as early as last September and then was given that time to circulate.
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you, there was a line in the piece that kind of got me choked up, which was about the kids who were dressing up, doing their hair and getting dressed up. It almost became like an event to go get this vaccine, given everything they've gone through. You know, just an
Yeah.
amazing scene to consider. It's a horrible situation what's happening there, but this, at least in a way, gives you some hope. Like even in a situation like that, to see this success where you've had both sides come together, the global community, the WHO, figure this out for hundreds of thousands of kids. It's definitely a remarkable story. And you know, Colin has mentioned Gaza is going to be a big topic, I'm sure, this week at the General Assembly. And having this story out there from you, I think it's really important for people to understand what went into making this happen.
So yeah, I was just thinking about what Colin said earlier in the conversation about global goods, and I think you know, eradicating polio, the world is on the cusp of eradication of polio. It's really an issue that it's in everyone's best interest to cooperate and you know, work to it. So whenever there is a country that's been polio free and they have a polio case under the international health regulations, it's an international public health concern. And so, you know, there's this immediate need to do what is needed to eradicate it in that area.
It's also interesting. I mean, from what I was talking about before, you know, this Secretary General has really focused on, if not peacemaking, you know, are there areas where the UN has added value? And this is, you know, it's a sad, you know, example of the limits of the UN role, but it is a clear example where there are things on the margins that the UN can do to improve life of, you know, people who are suffering in conflict or otherwise. But it, you know, you know, it doesn't at all get to the root of, you know, what's causing all of this. But I think it sort of in a way is reflective of how the UN sort of in some ways sees its role these days.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it
I
was,
think that's fair.
and each there was kind of the different arms of the UN that each played a role. You know, like WHO is very like focused on the surveillance and with the monitors to ensure that that 90% is reached. UNICEF played the role of the logistics of bringing in the vaccines. UNRWA, with its huge kind of imprint in Gaza, was able to kind of coordinate the personnel and do the actual delivery. So they really worked kind of in coordination to ensure that this very complicated mission was effective, along with the Ministry of Health in Gaza.
Yeah, in many ways, and we can even see this with our own presence at UNGA and our community's presence at UNGA column. In many ways, it used to be a place for diplomats. You know, the UN and the General Assembly, it was a place where diplomats came to hash out important things like conflict resolution. That may be waning quite a bit now, given the geopolitical realities you talked about. But in some ways, it puts the other UN agencies even more in the driver's seat. There's much more need given how many global issues there are, like climate, like AI, like global health, that know no borders. And so in the, I don't know, 10 or 12 years that Devex has been a presence there, we just keep seeing more and more interest and demand and growth of this week in New York. I mean, the traffic, the events, it's all worse, you know, than it was 10 years ago, because there's such a demand to be a part of it. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that these are global challenges. And there's a sense that, you know, if not there at the UN, then where do you go to actually try to address these? So major global corporations are there, big international NGOs, private foundations, governments of all kinds. You know, they're all gathered there. They're all making announcements. They're all trying to push forward some kind of a positive agenda on whatever their slice of this bigger global
Right.
development pie might be.
Yeah, and tech too. Tech, I mean, Microsoft has a big shiny office, you know, in the same building where, you know, the UK and the French, you know, diplomatic missions are. Other tech, I mean, they're all very curious about, the UN wants to play a kind of governance role in internet, and they want to be part of creating that or helping to sort of, inform that discussion. I mean, one of the things that's sort of interesting, I mean, you're right about how, the balance of, I don't know if it's the balance of power, but the balance of sort of energy is kind of in some ways shifted out of the building onto the streets beyond First Avenue. But, in this discussion on the Future Summit, it's revealed a lot of frustration from the diplomats that the UN is drawing back from this mediation role, and is a request for the Secretary General, to come up with some, new formula for addressing this. I mean, the sense is, okay, if you don't believe in peacekeeping the way we can conduct it, if you, are not engaged in sort of mediation, then like give us a plan, like show us, a way to get the UN back into this game, because a lot of delegations really want the UN back in the mediation game.
Just as we kind of wrap up our conversation, Colin, I'm curious what this means, that sentiment that you're expressing, and maybe how this future summit wraps up. What does it mean for the election of the next SG, which
Right.
that campaign is on, and we're going to be, the candidates will be out in force this week in New York, no doubt, and their supporters. What does it all mean for who the great powers want to ultimately select to get into this seat?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult to figure out who the big powers can agree on, because ultimately, even though it's a sort of formal decision by the UN General Assembly and it's all of its 193 members, the real deciders are the permanent 5 members. You have someone like Mia Mottley, who's been part of the conversation, probably one of the best, most powerful orators of the age, very much focused on issues of financial reform. Everybody wants to be photographed with her. President Biden, in Los Angeles during, the Summit of the Americas, was hanging out with her the whole time. But would the Americans want someone who is sort of drawing attention to kind of the divide between the North and the South? I don't necessarily think so. So they may love to be pictured with her, but I don't know that they would support her. But there are other candidates as well. Rebecca Grinspan, the head of UNGTAD, who was very much involved in the Ukraine grain deal. Other
And
candidates.
she fits the bill in terms of national origin too, right? Because there's a regional issue here, right? Maybe just explain that to people.
Right. Yeah. So generally, there is a tendency and a practice of, regions, like power devolves from regional groups in the UN. And so the Latin American and Caribbean group, GRULOC, has not had the Secretary General post since Javier Perez de Cuellar. So there was a sense that it was owed to them the last time they didn't get it. And so now there's an expectation that it probably should go to a Latin American and probably a woman. So there's a lot of focus on Latin American foreign ministers, women who are foreign ministers. And that's part of the conversation that's kind of playing out now. But basically, this General Assembly is the starting point of the race. I mean, a decision will be made probably in the summer as to who the next Secretary General will be. The candidates have not come out publicly and declared their interest, but they're, like, as you said, they're out lobbying like crazy right now. And they are going to have to, come out and start, campaigning publicly pretty soon, as they have for the last few Secretary General races.
Yeah, it's a really tricky position to campaign for, because in some ways, the more outspoken you are, the less attractive you are to the great powers. Right. A little bit like you talked about with Prime Minister Mia Mottley. Do they want a firebrand who's going to bring her own political force and political capital, her own strong views to the table? Or do they want somebody who can be a little bit more in the middle, more diplomatic, kind of
Right.
smooth over the edges between the great powers and their conflict? So as a result, it's a really tricky thing, and a lot of the campaigning, so to speak, happens behind closed doors as a result.
They'd probably prefer someone who doesn't, like, rattle their cages, right? But another sort of, this is kind of the strangest of the UN, is that it's the P5 making the final decision, but it's going to be very important what the Latin American and Caribbean group decides. And, and Mia Mottley is from Barbados, English speaking, island? So, it's not clear that the Spanish-speaking Latin American world is going to be keen. I mean, if one remembers Kofi Annan, when he became Secretary General, he had to take French lessons in order to sort of win over the French so that they would support his candidacy, because in the initial stages, they weren't big boosters, right? And so
Right. He's West
these
African,
issues,
remember?
these issues are important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, we've got to wrap up, but I hope our listeners get a sense for the insider take that Colin, that you and our other reporters are going to have on the ground and we're going to bring to you. There's a couple of ways you can get that. So Devex always hosts our own events on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. We've got 3 full days of programs this week. More individual events than I can count are happening around town that we're involved in. We're media partners at the Clinton Global Initiative. We will have reporters just all over Manhattan. So if you want to know what's going on, obviously subscribe to the Devex Newswire. If you are able to join our event in person, I think we're into a hundreds of person long waiting list at this point, but sign up if you want. If there's room, we'd love to have you. And obviously you can follow online, because we're going to stream a lot of the sessions that will get into really the insider issues on lots of these little verticals we've talked about, whether it's global health issues like AMR, or it's digital connectivity, or it's financial inclusion. We just have a lot of different issues that are going to be really important at this year's General Assembly, and that we're going to bring our audience along on. And we'll also get maybe a little bit of the inside scuttlebutt on that campaign for SG, and share that with our readers too. So, hey, it's been great to be with you, Colin, to be with you, Sarah. And thanks everybody for listening in. This has been another episode of This Week in Global Development.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, guys.